Hello, everyone, and welcome to lecture 13 for History 2013. Today, we'll be talking about antebellum idealism and reform impulses, 1820 to 1860. So, you'll notice that this is a bit of a different timeline than we had been looking at. And we're going to look at this will be our final one that we look at that just kind of gives us this general idea of things that are happening before the Civil War, before we actually launch into and start looking at the years right before and during the Civil War here. So let's go ahead and get started today. We're going to be talking about three things today. We're going to be talking about the Second Great Awakening, temperance, and reforms to slavery that occurred. Whoops, wrong thing. To start us off with the Second Great Awakening, this is a religious movement that really takes hold throughout America, and it's the second time that it happens. The first one happens way back during early settlement and is more of a European thing that kind of trickles over into America. The Second Great Awakening is primarily an American thing, and primarily on the north and eastern sides of the country. It's going to be this idea where, or this movement of Protestant ministers, so Christian ministers, who are really trying to get people to come back to the church, right? To have they're gonna argue that these modern impulses have taken hold and that people are not as moral and the country is not as moral as it used to be. It's lost its moral compass, and part of that will be tied up with slavery. There'll start to be some talks in these circles that slavery is not a Christian ideal, which had been around from the beginning. But this kind of really picks up the pace and brings in this extra group of people into this anti-slavery movement that previously were not there, that they hadn't really considered or thought about or believed. So the Second Great Awakening is important because it really takes all the white people of all classes into this storm of religious fervor. So it changes their priorities in their lives, but it also increases this idea, this narrative of slavery being immoral, slavery not being a Christian thing, and to start talking about getting rid of it. And that also goes along with temperance. Temperance was this movement to get rid of drinking, to get rid of alcohol. Now, the ultimate goal of temperance, the temperance movement, will not happen until the 1900s when we pass the constitutional amendment that starts prohibition and gets rid of all alcohol in the United States. But this idea is here, right? It starts all the way back here. Even prior to the 1800s, there are people who are talking about we shouldn't be drinking, we shouldn't have bars, we should not have alcohol as a part of our society. But it really starts to take off with that idea of the second or as another idea of the Second Great Awakening. So we see this kind of dual logic happening of abolitionism, so getting rid of slavery, and temperance, getting rid of alcohol, kind of happening at the same time, based on this new religious movement, based on this new input of Christian ideals here. And this is a contemporary drawing that would have been in a newspaper that is the drunkard's progress, and it shows how it's a little hard to see on here, but how even just mixing something in your water or drinking one beer can lead you all the way to being drunk and killing yourself or doing something else crazy. And then the idea comes around here too, leaving your wife and your children behind. That's really the people who are going to be behind this whole movement here. And then finally, we'll take a look at early reforms to slavery. So there are some ideas prior to actual Civil War that are ideas and reforms to try to deal with slavery, but they don't really get anywhere or solve the issue. The first one will be this idea of colonization that advocates moving African Americans out of the country and usually back to Africa. Now, keep in mind, this is happening hundreds of years after the first slaves are taken from Africa. So the slaves at this time that are living have never been to Africa. Their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents had never been to Africa. They may have heard about it and heard about their their ancestral homelands, if that was kept around and if that was talked about, but they had no experience. All that they know is life on the plantation, but besides that, life in America. They don't know anything other than that. But that doesn't matter. In 1816, the Society for the Colonization of Free People of Color of America was founded, with a goal to move these people, to expatriate them. And it is endorsed by lots of politicians of the time, especially Thomas Jefferson. He's a big proponent of it. But members of this, it's this idea that is driving this, is that Black and white people can't live together as equals, and so they need to, if we're going to free them, then they need to have their own society to live in. Approximately 200,000 free Black people in the United States were targeted for relocation to Africa, so they were tried to be forcibly moved. And in the end, by 1819, so 3 years after it starts, that group gets $100,000 from the federal government to really push this colonization project. And so what ends up happening is the colony of Liberia, on the west coast of Africa, is created, and the country's capital of Monrovia is named after the President James Monroe. So there are a bunch of people who either willingly take part in this or are forced to take part in this and create this country in Africa. But they retain this idea of American thankfulness there as well. We talked a little bit about Nat Turner's Rebellion previously, but we'll look at it a little bit more in detail here. It's going to occur in 1831 in Virginia, so about 30 years before the Civil War. And it's inspired by this evangelical Protestant fervor, right? So that Second Great Awakening, that's what we tie this all to here. He's going to preach to other enslaved people in Southampton County, and he's going to get a big reputation pretty quickly as being a prophet and someone who they really should be paying attention to. He'll organize these slaves into rebellion, and he will say that he's waiting for the sign from God for when to start the rebellion, which ultimately happens, or he takes as a sign, this eclipse that happens in August that tells him it's time to go now. Turner and as many as 70 other enslaved people will kill other slave masters and their families. So about 70 people will kill 65 people here. He will successfully evade capture from August until the end of October, where they'll find him, try him, hang him, and then behead and quarter him. So they waste no time in making him an example. Virginia will also put to death 56 other slaves who they believe to take part in the rebellion, either organizing it or actively killing and taking part of it. And this will all be done and completed by white vigilantes and organized militias as a response. So this all gets tied up into the same thing. But as a response to the slave rebellion, these white people will kill 200 more slaves throughout Virginia and the rest of the South in response to Nat Turner's rebellion here. And then finally, we have about abolitionism. I don't know why I can't speak today. Abolitionists are going to use these moral arguments to advocate the elimination of slavery. So these Christian arguments here, they are going to really make known the problems and the atrocities that are being committed under slavery. And they want to create a society that's equal for Black and white people. They want to bring about this mass change, this mass awakening in the United States of slavery, and that they want to transform the entire national conscience against the South's peculiar institution, that's slavery, that it's a peculiar thing that only happens in the South, is how that gets stylized a lot of times. Some notable reformers of this time: Frederick Douglass. He was born as a slave in Maryland in 1818, and he will escape 20 years later in 1838, and he'll finally move to New Bedford, Massachusetts, marry his wife, and reside there as a free person for the rest of his life. He'll begin to provide public lectures on slavery, and eventually will publish his own story. He will publish a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, which becomes a bestseller in his time, and you can still find copies of that today. He is going to be identified by name, the white people that brutalize him. So he's going to specifically call out his slave masters. He's not going to mince any words or try to protect any of their feelings. And so because of that, he will ultimately have to avoid to flee the United States to avoid being murdered by white people. But he continues to be really influential throughout this time, even once he's gone. And a lot of his writings will inspire white people to take up the abolitionist cause here. So he's a very important person to know. The textbook goes into a lot more detail about him and about that Second Great Awakening. And so you can see how all of this starts to get tied into this religious movement, where previously it had only been seen as an economic institution or a political institution. Now we're starting to see it as a religious institution as well, or a religious problem at least. And so he is one that will really try to help push that narrative forward and push it to say, you know, you can't just sit here and say some white people, these white people, these slave masters, some of these are your friends. They're treating us like this, and it's a problem. And so he will be a very big, important reformer of this time. But like I said, textbook goes into a lot more detail about him and about the other things that we've discussed today. So that'll bring us to the end of this lecture here today. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to post in our questions forum or send me an email. But other than that, that'll be the end of this lecture, and I'll see you back here for the next one.